Lovely, lovely to see some familiar faces and some new ones today. Lovely. Okay. Just give it 1, 2 more minutes for people to get through, and then we'll get cracking with today. Okay, lovely. Well, welcome everybody to this workshop today, and it's the third in our series of 3 deep dive workshops as part of the Community Wealth Building Summit for this week. And I think we've got a brilliant lineup for you today, and great to see many friends and familiar faces in the involved as participants with us as well. So thank you very much to everyone for coming along. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. We are recording the session today, so if you don't want to be on the recording, can you turn your camera off and mute? That would be really helpful. Obviously, just to improve sound quality for everybody, great if everyone could mute it while the speakers are speaking. We'd love to for everyone to know who's in the room today, so it'd be great if you could use the chat box to introduce yourselves and the organisation that you're from and make connections that way if you could. One other point is, for those of you who were at the beginning of our summit on Monday, you'll have heard Sarah, our chief exec, inviting everybody to reflect as the week goes on what you're listening to and discussing mean for you, and what reflections do you have about your own work and how you might take this forward. And so we've designed a form to capture these thoughts and commitments as you go along. We've called it the What Can You Do on Monday form. It should be called the Neil McInroy What Can You Do on Monday form. It was one of Neil's famous phrases when he was chief exec of CLES. So if as the session goes along today, something you think, oh, this is something I'm really I'm committed to taking forward, doesn't matter what it is, small, big, grand, really practical, then just pop it in the form that that Lisa's just posted in the chat there. And tomorrow at our closing session, we'll be picking out some of those What Can We Do on Monday forms to share with the wider group. So you might get picked for that as well if you fill in the form, which would be great. As well as delegates from the summit and our great panelists today, we've got some friends visiting, if you like, the session from other organisations. So a particular shout out to them for coming along. It's been really great to see you. So James from Co-ops UK, Donna from Wales Co-op Centre, Corinne from the Black Country LEP, Sarah Crawley there and from the Midlands. Hi Sarah, long time no see. Ewan from Participate Project, and Dan from TDA in Torbay. So lovely to have you all with us, and thanks for making the time. So just to let you know how the session's going to run this afternoon, in a little while I'm going to do a brief sort of overview of market development for a generative economy and our thoughts from CLES about where this really important topic sits in the wider community wealth building story. Then I'm going to hand over to John Heneghan from CLES, who's going to outline our live challenge for today's workshop, and that's drawn from our work in Wales. So John will do that. And then we'll hand over to our great panel, to Andrea, Pete, and to Neil, who are going to share some of their reflections on this question of market development, and particularly how that speaks to the live challenge set from Wales for us. And we'll have a little bit of time after they've finished speaking for a question and answer session and discussion with the panelists. And then we will break out into 5 breakout groups to share your own thoughts and experience from the places that you're working in, and for you to distill your own, as a group's, recommendations and suggestions for how our colleagues in Wales can address this challenge that John's going to outline. We are going to build in a short break halfway through, so hold on if you can to make that cup of tea or whatever it is. So about 3 o'clock I'll break for 5 minutes. Then I know these Zoom sessions by this point in the afternoon can get a bit eye swirly, can't they? So that's how we are going to go run the session today. If anyone has got any tech problems or anything else, use the chat box, and our amazing colleagues Lisa and Helen will do what they can to help you out. So without further ado, I'll leap into the substance of the session today, which is a topic I think absolutely at the heart of community wealth building, and its overarching intent to shift ownership of the economy away from businesses that extract wealth and value from places and towards locally rooted ethical businesses that in their very operations create benefit for communities, for workers and for place. And I was thinking about what Sam Sharf, who was with us at the opening panel of the summit this week, talked about as where social value is intrinsic and inherent rather than an add-on, and that's really the kind of businesses that we want and the kind of economy that we want to build. So we're interested in SMEs, we're interested in social businesses, we're interested in worker-owned organisations, mutuals, that greater diversity of businesses taking a greater share of the economy. And there's a lot of agreement about that, isn't there? We see a wide progressive alliance of people and organisations doing just that. But I think where community wealth building is really distinct, and I think particularly powerful, is that it says, well, that mustn't just be left to the valiant efforts of committed individuals to try and grow this stuff between the cracks of a broken system. You know, that bottom-up effort is absolutely critical, but left to do the heavy lifting, it just leads to inequality, it's unfair, and it won't bring around the scale of economic change that we need to see. It's doomed to stay small and valiant and not become the way that economies operate. And so community wealth building answers that. It says, well, okay, we harness the power of anchor institutions to make sure it doesn't remain the efforts of valiant individuals to do that work on their own. And it says, actually, these anchor institutions should be trying to create, to shelter those people and organisations who want to grow a different kind of economy, to channel their purchasing power to create a source of ready demand, to use their land, their buildings and finance at the service of exactly these kinds of businesses and enterprises, and enable them to get a bigger piece of the pie, particularly as we recover from the pandemic. But also for these organisations to collaborate with people at the grassroots who are up for this and can take it forward in their places, and to work with those organisations who can get alongside those people and play in places, and to help them to grow the organisations that they want to. And that's, if you like, the sort of bottom up meets top down of community wealth building. And I think that is where the market development that we're going to talk about today really takes place. So that all sounds all very well. I'm sure none of us would argue with it. But CLES has always been about the how. And I think what's really interesting when we sort of think about this market development piece is that over the last 10 years, less of that market development has happened in economic development than perhaps we might like. And actually, a lot of that work, the most examples of that kind of market development that pushes out the extractives and grows the generative local business, has happened in other places, and particularly in the world of adult social care. And that's why today we wanted to hear from Andrea Gospel and from Peter Watson up in Wigan, because in many ways, I think what they've done and what people in adult social care and good progressive adult social care departments across the country have been doing is to show us what the kind of economic development that is needed for this kind of market development is. What are the skills? What are the approaches? What are the capabilities that you need to really get at that kind of market development? Because it certainly is much more than a few top-down projects here and there. So in Wales, our colleague John and along with colleagues from Wales Cultural Development Centre and others have been working with local authorities and public service boards on just this question, really, alongside local authorities who really want to do this work and have worked hard to analyse the kind of opportunities there might be to drive this kind of change in their place. And it's that work that we've drawn on in preparing the live challenge that we're going to be facing and working through today in this session. So in a moment, I'm going to ask John Heneghan to talk to that challenge and explain what we're all going to be grappling with. You're going to be working through this in the breakout sessions later, and we will have some notes to remind you the detail of it. So don't worry about trying to scribble it all down. But just so before we get into the rest of the session, I'm going to hand over to you, John, to guide us through the challenge.
Thank you, Fran. So the scenario today comes from an area of mid Wales, a predominantly rural area with small market towns, a medium-sized city with a university, a population of about 80,000 people, a local business base that's broadly characterised by smaller enterprises. There are large national chains and multinationals also active in many sectors. The local authority has responsibility for social care and education, as well as for about 7,000 council homes, environmental services, planning, culture and welfare benefit administration. They've got a close working relationship, as Fran said, with public sector partners and come together formally through the local public service board. The council leadership in this area has recognised that the economy of the area doesn't always serve the interests of local people, and it's really strongly committed to using its resources and its influence to shape a more inclusive economy. The economic strategy has highlighted that there's sort of known structural weaknesses in aspects of the local foundational economy, especially the construction, adult social care and food supply sectors. So on construction, the council struggles to attract bidders to tender for larger major building projects. Its rurality means that some of the national chains are less interested, and the local market doesn't have any sort of suitable end-to-end construction firms. And where firms do come forward to bid, it can be difficult to secure additional social value. In terms of the adult social care market, again, the council struggles to attract suppliers to provide home care, in part because of the dispersed nature of the population. Current providers are a mixture of national chains and some smaller local organisations, but there's quite a big churn in the market. Many of those business models could be described as more extractive, with little investment in employees, the service and place, and the quality of care from current providers can be variable in terms of both quality and consistency of care, and there are concerns about employee pay and conditions. So the council sees an urgent need to lead quite a radical reshaping of this market, replacing extractive providers with more locally rooted ones who have got more of a long-term commitment to the well-being and thriving of their employees, the people they serve and the place. On food supply, the majority of food procured for the public plate, whether that be kind of hospital, care home or school meal settings, is sourced from national wholesale suppliers. And it can be challenging to connect the kind of disparate, smaller local food producers into those supply chains. So the council and other public sector partners are interested in using their spending on food as a means for stimulating a more environmentally and socially productive food supply sector in the area. And just to finish with it, just a few comments, I guess, in terms of wider policy context. So the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act means that there's a specific legislative focus on improving the economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being of people and communities in Wales. The Welsh Government also prioritised strengthening the foundational economy, so those sectors which deliver the everyday goods and services that people across Wales depend on. And this challenge of what's called the kind of missing middle is also recognised as a kind of national concern, that many local economies have an over-dependence on micro and small-sized enterprises and a relative lack of medium-sized businesses. So yeah, that's the live challenge for today. I'll hand back to Fran.
Lovely. Thanks, John. That was great. So that's our challenge for today. This area of Wales in real life, we've amalgamated two areas and their challenges to give us something to go at today, but these are absolutely rooted in the reality of these places. So particular challenges for this area around the construction market, around home care and around food supply. So those are going to be where we're really exercising ourselves today, as well as the broader challenge of how you might develop a more generative, locally rooted economy. Okay, so with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to our panel who are going to share their own experience of this question of market development for a generative economy, and to offer their own thoughts and suggestions to our colleagues and friends in Wales on their particular scenario. So I'm going to start with Andrea Gospel. back in 2019, I was at a session with Andrea and with Peter, who's going to talk in a minute, from Cherish. They did this absolutely brilliant double act about the work that they'd done on ethical home care, and I've not stopped talking about it since, as many of my CLES colleagues can attest. It'll become obvious why in a minute, I think. Andrea's got over 15 years experience in health and social care, both in local government and in the social sector. It was her and her team who designed the ethical home care framework as a tool to transform the care market in Wigan and to build community wealth. And I'm always really struck when I talk to Andrea about how those two goals were so clear in the work that they did. And she's absolutely relentless in her pursuit of both of those goals, and currently working with the team on supported living and day support services, and really pushing the envelope about where the opportunities might be to diversify the kind of businesses operating in the borough, so thinking towards employee ownership and other alternative forms of ownership. So with no further ado, over to you, Andrea.
Thank you. Thanks, Fran. So yes, we've just been asked to come along to talk through some of the headlines really of our journey changing the shape of the home care market in Wigan over the past few years, and particularly kind of making that step change, I think, through kind of social value being a bit of a bolt-on to kind of community wealth building spirit, kind of just running through the DNA of the work that we do really. So just take us back kind of 5-6 years ago in Wigan. So our landscape was no different really to kind of many other places really, a national broken system of home care, perhaps defined by norms around 0 contracts, time and task, 15-minute visits. The market kind of dominated perhaps by kind of larger national organisations. In Wigan, I think we had 25 providers delivering about 21,000 hours of care to about 2,000 people across the borough. Huge spectrum of cost and quality, no correlation between the two really, and in fact kind of it ranged from probably about £11 to kind of £22 an hour back in 2015, and you could guarantee kind of the the ones that we were paying £22 an hour were probably getting £5-6 an hour to the frontline workforce. So broken in loads and loads of different kind of respects, really. And we just really wanted to kind of change this. We really wanted to kind of root out decent, ethical partners, providers who share our values, our vision, got a good track record, and really wanted to kind of, I suppose, liberate that in Wigan and kind of make it happen for us. Because the irony was, coming through a kind of public sector procurement process, that process naturally would kind of turn certain providers on and turn other providers off, and we actually wanted to attract the ones that it perhaps turned off really. So we kind of knew we had to do something different. Kind of really, what did we do? We really wanted to kind of go back to the drawing board really, and truthfully that's what we did. We kind of know our communities well. We were seeing and hearing really great things about some of the providers that were working in Wigan, but we weren't contracting with, we weren't kind of working with, because perhaps some of our systems processes, they weren't the ones that we were talking to. So we started by kind of basically very practically kind of going finding really good kind of kindred spirits, I think I would like to describe them as really, and started to kind of co-design a really strong vision. Not just of the bread and butter of home care, but what's the vision in Wigan? We're very committed to an asset-based approach, what people can do, not what they can't do, not fitting people into boxes of what they can't do. So kind of just using we've got the deal in Wigan, that kind of like mutual kind of informal contract, working to people's assets and strengths, but also the real key kind of driver behind the framework, the ethical framework, was the best terms and conditions and supportive employment practice for the workforce. You have a happy workforce, a kind of committed workforce, and that just kind of like reads through in terms of the support that your local people kind of receive. So basically we kind of started way kind of before kind of you'd even talk about pre-market engagement or whatever kind of terms you want to describe. We just got in a room really, and we talked with other people who were kind of committed to kind of achieving the shared vision with us. And had a collaboration really about providers that shared a genuine passion and commitment to invest in Wigan. So it was about us really articulating that and what we were looking for, and working with procurement rules and laws. Kind of we can't be absolutely exclusive in that, although kind of we have got a bias, but we have got room in kind of Wigan for kind of mixed providers, large, medium, small, national, local, but there are some non-negotiables with that, and the non-negotiables really are where the money's invested. 80% we're looking for in frontline costs, but we're also looking at other kind of rewards and recognition and contributions to the local area as well. So in the context of community wealth building, contextually, the investment in social care is not insignificant. So it's £11 million in home care in Wigan, £110 million across all market areas. So we're not just buying or procuring services, personal care services. It's about using our leverage to direct that investment where it counts most. I think that's the work we've done kind of successfully in Wigan with some real allies and kindred spirits. So we think kind of if we select our providers wisely, we use that money wisely, we can make sure as much of that stays in the borough through goods, salaries, local services and other kind of social value contributions. So through real conversation with our providers and residents, we've set about co-designing our ethical framework, which really clearly describes our vision and our expectations and those non-negotiables through that procurement process. So some of the key factors were, we needed to make sure that we were working with a market that's sustainable for the provider, absolutely. Profit is not a dirty word at all, but it's got to be affordable as well for the kind of local authority. So we work really openly and transparently with trusted allies and providers, and Pete's one of those. He's going to talk about things from his perspective shortly, about what a financial model would look like in terms of decent profit and return, but not extractive in its approach and kind of majorly investing in the frontline workforce. We also learn through those conversations some of the unintended consequences of commissioning in a way that's not rooted in a two-way conversation. So we were putting burdens on providers that we didn't want, we didn't ask for, but they were just unintended really. So Wigan is a 77 square mile borough. It was commissioned across the place. So that was quite difficult for providers to kind of operate within. So we were told to have a kind of operating presence that's kind of sustainable and affordable, with there's a minimum volume of activities and some technical detail behind that, about 1,000 hours stacks up, and people told us loud and clear. We also were really committed to working in community and place for many, many reasons. The layers of benefit there, not just in terms of community wealth building, but in terms of employment practice, carbon footprint, kind of helping people to work and live in the area that they have grown up in, kind of reducing travel time, which obviously has an economical kind of impact on kind of cost and prices. With ethical providers who weren't extractive in their nature, a neighbourhood model of support that also kind of helped local providers to grow and thrive. So we were directing our procurement process and our model really to, I guess, support local homegrown providers, to give them a bit of a leg up, because we knew it was thrive in that environment, because we were testing and as opposed to procuring home care, where you might kind of make that kind of a bit more difficult because you're not measuring the right kind of things. So critically kind of just worked with them and kind of really tried to kind of look at the demographics, kind of I think key success factors for me were just really about listening, understanding, co-designing. I think I'm conscious of time because Fran's just come back on, and she knows I can talk for a very long time about this. It's kind of something that's very, very dear to our hearts. But we've now got a really strong, solid partnership of 9 ethical providers. In the main, they're local and regional. We've got a couple of larger national providers where we're really clear on what that means in terms of their practice and kind of how they invest locally in the place. And Pete, I think, will be able to probably segue quite nicely and talk a little bit about what that means, because I think from a provider perspective, but it's underpinned by joint kind of ambition, vision, values, and honesty and a truth and a mutual respect and commitment, I think, to the place, Wigan as a place. And I'm sorry for kind of rushing, because I could speak much longer, but I think I'm getting the eye from Fran, and that's
yeah, I could listen all day, Andrea, but but we'll get into some more of it in the Q&A afterwards. So thank you. Wonderful. Great. Okay, it's amazing how quickly 7 minutes can go, isn't it? So Pete was the other half of this great double act that I saw in Wigan. It was Peter's experience in Wigan, but also your reflections, Pete, on what it's been like in your career to work in different kinds of businesses and how different that feels. That that really struck me, and I think it's a voice that we seldom hear in community wealth building, and it's a really important one. So really grateful for you to be here today. Pete is the chairman of Cherish UK, and is going to talk a bit more about that and what you do. I know they're a leading provider of care services across the Northwest, and I'll hand over to you now, Pete. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Francis. Well, I'm the other half of the duo to Andrea today, so good afternoon, everybody. I can probably talk about as long, really, if we get going between us. So, but I've made some summary notes that I think were important to try and get across in terms of Andrea's speaking from a design and commissioning basis, and we are actually a provider. We're on the ground and we're doing the work, if you like. So quite rightly, I think for us, really, we were part of a team that helped to co-design and then co-deliver pretty significant change, I think, in the home care service as part of this ethical framework exercise in Wigan. I think, as described, obviously, by Andrea, there is a level of partnership and an ongoing long-term trust that is quite unsurpassed for us, and we work in a lot of other areas in the Northwest as well. And the move to a small framework offered us operationally a lot of advantages, many of which we asked for at the beginning. And I'll summarise those for you now. I think originally there was about 14 areas in Wigan. Wigan's a massive place, by the way. If you don't know it, it's a really big borough. And we got responsibility for 2 areas. So you can call them a locality, an area, a neighbourhood, whatever. But we are solely responsible as a provider for actually providing home care and other services within that area. We're not competing for work with any of the other providers in Wigan. And we've sort of had to be operationally strong over the years to take in all the work, because you need to take that responsibility on. You have to take the level of work, including the spikes in demand, which in times is quite challenging. But operationally, the ability to work within a locality means that we can employ different sectors of the community. For instance, we employ quite a significant amount of non-drivers and other minority sort of areas of the workforce. That might be working parents or other people with commitments, including care commitments for their own relatives. We do guaranteed hours, and we do guaranteed hours because we've got responsibility for an area and we know what that's going to be. So there's some element of continuity. There's variability in the hours, but it's 10% either way on an ongoing basis. So we know what we need to do. So we're happy to guarantee hours. But I think we're also, and Andrea particularly has pushed this forward, that we actually build contracts around availability for people to work for us, so that we're flexible for them and they're flexible for us. And this has worked really well for us, even through the COVID-19 pandemic period, which has been difficult for everybody. I think also for me, Wigan do actively measure investment in the town and in the borough. And for us, this means that, we employ more than 95% of our workforce from Wigan Borough. They live within the borough itself. We use local suppliers like garage up the road from the office for our pool cars. And we actually ended up purchasing offices and training premises in the town because we wanted to put a marker down ourselves and prove, if you like, as a provider that we were here and we were staying. And we know this is part of the deal with Wigan. It's part of the culture and part of the deal that you sign up to. In exchange for that, we've actually steadily built our business over the last 8 or 9 years with Wigan on home care service. And they've also encouraged us, where we've got other levels of expertise in things like supported living, to bid for other contracts in that as well. So they've been very supportive when we've sort of vertically integrated our services within the borough. And that's been very much a win-win for both of us, really. I think I'd say probably over the last 2 years, we've jointly embraced digitalisation together as well as a partnership. It's a strange thing to say, but in some aspects of our service, digitalising aspects of it has actually sort of revolutionised the way that we operate and the way that we can report service and actually performance manage ourselves and report that back to the council. So I think that's really helped us move on a hell of a lot in terms of transparent performance management. And I'd say lastly for us really, away from the council, we've probably got an unprecedented level of relationship with our fellow providers in Wigan. We've supported each other quite a lot over the past sort of 2 years, particularly with the COVID and the pandemic. And that can be the often promise where you will say, well, if you're really short, we'll cover some work for you. In reality, it never usually happens that, but in Wigan, it does happen, and we do it all the time. And we've had other providers who have got things. One of the providers got an infection control company coming in, actually helping to keep our offices open throughout the way, and didn't want paying for it. So I think we've got a real good level of cooperation. We all know each other really, really well. I've got the mobile numbers of all the registered managers and owners of companies within Wigan, and we really haven't got that anywhere else. I think that's helped us all as a group through the challenge. So it's very much a win-win situation, I think, for us in terms of our Wigan partnership. I'm going to very quickly, if I've got time, Francis, really quickly. In my early days, I left school. I was an apprentice plasterer when I left school, and I worked in construction for about the first 10 years of my working life, eventually managing new housing builds for Balfour Beatty as a site manager. And I just thought it was quite interesting that you've looked at construction, you know, 30 odd years ago when I was involved in it. We employed lots of subcontractors locally where we were working, but it was real ad hoc basis. It would be people literally coming up to the fence of the site and saying, do you need any bricklayers or joiners or whatever, you know. There were very, very, I think, few opportunities at the time for any businesses to club together in any sort of consortia. There was nobody or anything that in existence that would pull that together. I just think that is a great opportunity for the future, particularly within construction. And very lastly for me, I just think as a private provider, as an SME, if you like, some of the tender processes that are operating currently, I would say not in Wigan, but currently generally, they do lend themselves to large and established companies. Some of these companies have professional writing teams that submit tenders. And I don't think that small businesses can compete with this in any way for obvious reasons. And maybe a changing process or a changing tender objective might help to sort of level things out into the future.
Brill. Thank you very much, Pete. And again, really looking forward to getting stuck into the Q&A with you and the wealth of experience you bring to all of that. Fantastic. Okay, so last but by no means least, Neil McInroy needs very little introduction. He was CEO of CLES for 21 years until he left us in the summer, and he's probably got more experience of progressive local economic development than just about anybody else this side of Andrea's backdrop. In the it's fair to say that community wealth building in the UK wouldn't be anywhere near where it is today without Neil's pioneering work and his relentless energy, and I can attest to that, and commitment to social justice. Since leaving CLES this summer, he's focused on his role as community wealth building advisor to the Scottish Government, and he's a senior fellow at our great friends, the Democracy Collaborative, and he is our last speaker on the panel today. So Neil, over to you.
Afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Fran. Thanks for those kind words. But Community Wealth Building is this workshop would be testament to it's a work of many hearts and minds. So delighted to be here and back at my CLES. As people that leave CLES, you never lose, you never leave. There's always a little bit maybe with CLES. My heart's there. So thanks very much. I want to talk briefly, really, about how we get more people enjoying a bigger slice of the pie. Before I give a little example from Chicago, where I'm working now with a good colleague who's on this call, Sarah McKinley, when we're working with the Democracy Collaborative in the US. And in particular, I'm going to riff a little bit and then give you some sort of pick up on what Andrew and Pete's been saying. But for me, there's an important point. I'm telescoping out a little bit, not quite as far as Andrea's backdrop, but I'm telescoping out a bit here. We need to have the rationale really of why we're doing something up front. Because if we don't have the rationale why we're doing something up front, you tend to lose focus on what the problem is. Yeah. And we all know when trying to change things, there's a lot of inertias, there's a lot of blockers, there's a lot of barriers. So we need to always be reminded and lured almost to what we're trying to fix. So what is this problem here we've been saying? What is it trying to fix? Now, fundamentally, the challenge here is how we shape in markets to get more people, as Fran indicated, more people getting a slice of the wealth pie. Yeah, we need to be moored then to the problems of wages, wage share, ownership of wealth. Now, a little bit of an aside, wage share is the proportion of total UK national income that goes back to workers in wages. Now, right at this very moment, in UK and in Wales, and in mid-Wales, where this exercise is put, there's a massive problem. Imagine £100 of all wealth, yeah? £50 would come back in wages, yeah? In the 70s, 60s, 70s and 80s in Wales and in the UK, you could expect about 60% of all wealth coming back in wages. Now, it's slipping around 50%. We're back to figures it was in the Industrial Revolution period in the 1850s. Wealth is being extracted at a rate of knots, and it's even worse in the US, actually, I should say. So we need to think about wealth in this problem in the whole round. Where does that 50% that's not coming back in wages go? That's a fundamental problem for this task we've been put here. And where is it going? Wealth extraction through shareholder dividend to big corporates in food and in care. Yeah. Pete's doing a great job, Andrew's doing a good job, but let's face it, a lot's getting extracted by those big corporate players in shareholder dividend, not in wages, because those people tend to have low wages in that sector. And secondly, endemic low wages. Low wages itself, even get a job, yeah, for the workers, not just in care, but in food as well, and in parts of retail. Endemic low wages. So the challenge then, what do public contractors and what do we need to do? Well, there's a few things we do. Firstly, we need to support small local firms within supply chains, of course. By default, by the very nature of how they work, they extract less wealth and generate more wealth for local workers and places. Small firms, as CLES work did, pioneering work CLES did maybe a wee while ago, maybe 10 years ago, we found that 58% of, if you've got a local firm, 58% is income, wealth is retained in the local economy if you get a small firm doing it. 58%, yeah, more. Small firms, Pete, you don't have any offshore investments and offshore shareholders. You're not popping to you've not got a PO box in the Cayman Islands. No, he's shaking his head, thank God for that. No, of course he doesn't. Of course he doesn't. Small firms don't tend to have that, yeah. Small firms tend to have a fairer distribution of profit and income. I'm sure Pete deservedly earns a lot of money, yeah, but the gap won't be massive. If you go in millions and the workers earning a few £1,000s, no way. There's a fairer distribution of income. And smaller firms have, as Pete said, have shorter supply chains, and that helps with zero carbon policy. So that's the first thing. Support local firms. Second thing, real living wage policies. Fundamental role for the public sector to force that real living wage through the supply chain. And thirdly, inclusive ownership. We need to grow employee-owned firms and co-ops, etc., because those forms of organisation don't just get wealth through wages, important as it is, but as owners, through dividends and profit share. Then we can eat into that 50% that disappears away. Pre-distribute wealth, it's called. Turning a little bit to Chicago, food in Chicago, and tell me to shut up for a minute. I'll be finished in 3 minutes, Fran. Let's look at food in Chicago. Chicago, fabulously wealthy city, but poverty, inequality, low wages endemic. The City of Chicago set up the Office for Equity and Racial Justice, and they've embarked on a community wealth building approach, and it's supported by my organisation, Democracy Collaborative, and myself and my colleague Sarah who's on the call. As regards food, there are significant and rising levels of food insecurity exacerbated by the pandemic, particular issues in the south and the west of the city. The people in those parts of the city are experiencing disproportionately worse health outcomes, including life expectancy, compared to richer parts. There is big corporate monopolisation of food. In response, to this food inequality and insecurity, Mayor of Chicago, Laurie Lightfoot, has instituted a food equity agenda supported by a food equity council and woven into a community well-built approach for Chicago. This is multi-pronged, aimed at making structural changes to that sector, that Chicago does become an equitable food city and community wealth is growing. Now, there's three aspects of this very quickly. One, capital. Black, Indigenous and people of colour, businesses and entrepreneurs don't have enough capital. There's deserts, capital deserts to those communities. These BIPOC businesses, as they're called, are less likely to secure funding from banks. So the city is trying to address that by exploring the creation of a Park City funded Chicago Food Fund to target investments into those communities, including urban farming, urban food growing. Secondly, eliminating barriers to smaller entrants to that food sector. There's many planning, legislative and certification barriers in that food sector. And they're looking to look at that whole apparatus of how it can free up the smaller provider. And thirdly, and finally, procurement. The city and county departments of Chicago and sister agencies like Chicago Housing Authority, Chicago Schools, Chicago City Colleges, Chicago Parks, they spend $300 million a year annually on food. Yeah, so we're thinking about new co-ops. It includes a great organisation called Chai Fresh Kitchens, a black-owned worker co-op contracting business. It started during the pandemic with 5 formerly incarcerated worker owners. Through support from American Rescue Plan in the city of Chicago, they're hoping to take over a 6,000 square foot vacant building, which allows them to scale up to provide more decent food at decent prices and also plug in to the public sector supply chain. Pete talked about training around procurement, tender support, also that's happening in Chicago, really important, and then securing minimum wages and secure work through the supply chain. So finally, I'll shut up. In all of this, the central question that we're imposing this problem is how do we grow markets? Is to lure ourselves to the fundamental questions of wealth share. We should never forget about that because we need to, because we can easily get diverted by barriers and inertias and what people want to take us in a much more minimalist path. Wealth share is a massive issue in growing. Ownership models are key, and there's a vital role for public sector procurers in not only purchasing well, but in fundamentally shaping the market. Public sector agencies are economic market shapers. Get on it, and that will be the way by which we provide broader levels of social, ecological and equal justice for our communities all over the UK and in Mid Wales.
Rallying stuff, Neil. Thank you very much. Brilliant, and brilliant to hear about that example from over in Chicago. And food is such an interesting sector, isn't it? So multifaceted and so fundamental. And I think through the pandemic kind of become even more vivid for many people. So brilliant. Thank you. Right. Some opportunities for some questions. We've had some in the chat and I can see, Andrea, you've been busy responding directly, which is brilliant. But just wanted to raise Myri from North Ayrshire's question in the chat there, which was about perhaps a technical question in some ways, but speaks to a broader point, I think. So it was a question for you, Andrea, about how do you build into the tendering process the kind of need to align values between you and the potential suppliers? And I think maybe, Neil, this kind of comes to you as well, because there's plenty of people who would have you believe they ran ethical ships, wouldn't it? Aren't there? But to your kind of your standout challenge to us all, does it actually pay their do they actually pay their way or not? Then this isn't just about, you know, can they write the right stuff on a tender document, is it? It's about how can you really make sure that you're finding the fellow travellers and businesses that you want. So Andrea, do you want to kick us off and then we'll open that up?
Yeah, no problem. It's a really good question, actually, because, yeah, we put a lot of legwork into that earlier doors. We had to go and find and kind of convince kind of the partners that we wanted to attract, that we weren't just kind of going out for the usual suspects. I mean, being really clear, we're not interested in bid writers. So the questions that we designed were interested in local knowledge, case studies, examples, not kind of a bid that promises the world and delivers something different. We also did a lot of kind of work with local providers, drawing board stuff with the kind of 68-page kind of ITT, kind of what do we really need, working with our procurement colleagues to really strip out stuff that's kind of, we don't need that. We want to kind of attract a different kind of a different kind of partnership here. So we did a lot of work pre and during it as well. So again, encouraging actively kind of, I suppose kind of trying to kind of favour kind of things that we knew that they would thrive with, and they would like love and relish telling the stories about, and making that count in a procurement process. So I am interested in kind of lots of words, theory. That's not the things that we're going to be counting. We're going to be counting kind of real, authentic, supportive employment practice. Tell us about your kind of your contracts, your terms and conditions. Our very first presentation, kind of a well recognised and well rewarded workforce is the key to brilliant care and support. Talk to us about it. Tell us how you deliver that in practical terms. So all of our questions and tests. So I've been a provider, delivery provider. I'm not procurement or commissioning kind of. I've not grown up in this world. So I think able to really think through, what do we really want to get to the heart of it? What do we want to really authentically test? And having the confidence and backup politically as an organisation as well as kind of technically from a pure procurement perspective, making that count and exposing where that's not the case. So really asking really hard questions around financial modelling, open book accounting, transparency. Where's your, what's your profit margin? Where you're investing? What's your progression routes for your workforce? So it's asking really kind of careful and insightful questions and making those count. And invariably, because they strike at the heart of your partners who've got a shared vision and values, that they're already in a more advantageous position, really. So actually, you've flipped it. You've got bid writers scurrying around who are based in Milton Keynes, trying to find out about local support services. There are much more at hand to our local providers. So they're also more comfortable in the space as well. I mean, we're recommissioning at the moment. So there is a bit of TLC and hand-holding, but obviously we need to do that in a safe, legal and transparent way, because everybody's got to have equal opportunity. But actually, I think if you frame your procurement process, your questions, what you're interested in, right, I think you can expose what you want and what you don't want quite easily. And that's what we've done kind of technically. And it's not they're all public documents that everybody has got access to, so you can see some of that, and I'm more than happy to share it. But it's really getting to the heart of what good and care support looks like. The other thing that we did as well, just quickly, we worked with local residents to describe what good care and support looks like, and there are 12 I statements that have been crafted with local people. And if I say anything to kind of, I say, once we've been through the procurement, if you put the spec on the shelf, do not put page 27 on the shelf, because if you work to those 12 I statements, you won't go far wrong in terms of delivering good care and support, because it's talking about things like, I want you to help to find things that make me tick, notice when I get poorly early so I've got the best chance of getting better. So kind of really authentic descriptions of good care, not minute-to-minute billing, tell me about your electronic care record system. So it's like really getting to the heart of what good care looks like.
Brill, thanks Andrea, loads there. Just before I come to Neil, Pete, do you want to, what's it like being at the other end of it? Because you said it in other places it doesn't feel like that, so yeah.
Well, I mean, I was going to try and jut in at the end, but I think Andrea will be reasonably modest about this. But we're in our 10th year now at Wigan. We've been there 9 years, and when they first went to a locality framework, not every provider that was there 5 years ago on that original framework is there bidding now. And I think in the model that they operate, if you don't live it, you get found out really, really quickly. And once you get found out, you might get a chance to put it right, but if you don't, you're gone. And there are some providers that have exited Wigan at the borough's request, if you like, mid the way through a process. So I think they're living it. And if you don't live it as well, then you're going to get found out really quickly, Francis, to be fair. No, it's not as good in other areas. I think other areas I alluded to on the tender process, some other areas that we work in, I won't name them, but other areas we work in tend to be more can I say, fascinated by the larger providers and what they say they're going to do rather than what they do. Now, we've earned our spares in other areas as well, but it's been far easier here because I think if you're a values-based organisation, you'll thrive. If you're not, you'll get found out really quickly.
Real. Neil, do you want to come in? It's a question of how would you find your good ones? How do you... Oh, can't hear you, Neil.
Three things come to mind. To my view is that we've had 8-9 years of the social value, and part of it's become a racket, which is particularly used and abused by some suppliers who are particularly good at showing glossy ways that they're delivering on social value, but in actuality aren't. So it's become a racket, and the bigger, more well-funded organisations tend to be better at playing that racket. So we need better compliance, and we need to invest in compliance from a public sector procurement point of view to check that they're actually doing it. The second thing is that actually, as CLES has argued, and I would continue to argue, is that we need a social licence to operate in some sectors. So there's almost like a red line. So if you don't provide real living wage, you don't have a unionised workforce, you don't have good terms and conditions, you don't offer things to the community, you don't actually get to enter to bid. So it's like a red line. You don't get to bid if you don't have that pre-qualification that's very strong. So a social licence to operate. And thirdly, I would say is that in some sectors, the market is so rotten that it actually needs to be quite managed quite strongly. I think that, you know, for instance, the National Care Service in Scotland is looking at exploring how, opposed to the atomisation of the market, it seeks to actually control the market at a national level, then commission locally accordingly. And I think those sorts of things will ensure compliance, because it will create proper resume and standards of what we expect as a nation in terms of care for all our people. So there does need to be these big mechanisms to ensure compliance, and particularly in care for a decency and dignity that we'll all need in our old age.
Brilliant. Right, the questions are coming thick and fast, which is going to be, we'll just have a few more. So there's a question from Sarah Crawley about how long this all takes, which I think is really important. I mean, you've talked years, haven't you, Andrea? And I think that speaks to what you're talking about there, Neil, about some of this it's not 1, 2, 3 years, is it? So yeah, quick thoughts on that while we harvest a few more questions.
Do you want me to come in? Yeah. So we're kind of 6 years in, but we've been reaping the rewards for 5. So, like, you know, we're just kind of continuing to transform, really. So, kind of, whilst kind of it takes legwork kind of to get the partners in place, when you've got your partners in place, you can start doing business. So we're never done, we're never finished. We're going through our second cycle of recommissioning. There will be some changes, learning from what we've learned already, but the model still holds, and we continue to do more at a pace, really, and expect more. I think this time round, I think we're more clearly articulating what we mean and see by community wealth building, and what that contribution can actually mean. I think in the first time, 6 years ago, it was a bit by accident, really. It was a vision that kind of like we discovered it was called community wealth building, actually. But now we're doing it in a much more conscious fashion. So I don't start in a certain area. If you can't try and boil the ocean, yeah, of course. So we started with home care, but we have been reaping the rewards of that positive ethical partnership for several years now. And going into the pandemic, the reason that we've been so resilient in Wigan is because we weren't making a start. You hear a lot of partners recently saying, oh, our relationship has been superb, like through. Well, we already had it. We'd already got that there. So and then I guess now we're moving into other market areas, supported living, care homes, other kind of areas that have got different nuts to crack, really. But I'd say don't be put off. A procurement cycle can take 6 months, but it's time worth investing, and it is our bread and butter job, really, to have decent, brilliant, kind of innovative, creative, kind of ethical care providers, and it's our job, it's our daily job to do that.
Look, yeah, brilliant. Go on, Neil. Looks like you're coming in on time too.
Yeah, no, great. I mean, obviously, you know, you've got a big forces at play here. You can't boil the ocean. You've got to start somewhere. But we need to have the big maximalist aim here. This is actually, you know, we're in a pretty perilous state until it comes to like the ecological crisis, the massive inequality crisis, and so forth across the world. We need to be maximalist about here, But I love that phrase that Roberto Ungar, the Brazilian philosopher and politician, says. He says that the minimalist is the epiphanies of possibilities. What Andrea and Peter are talking about, I'm not belittling it, it's epiphany of a possibility. And those epiphany moments need to be escalated and scaled up. That's what's key, and that's where big policy comes in. So it is a long-term project, but we can start something on Monday. We can do those small things, but don't think that's it. No, we've got a maximalist project, which is to save us all, actually, in terms of the poverty and climate crisis that's there. So I think we shouldn't be daunted by the scale. We should see these small things we do as epiphanies of possibilities, and we do more and more and more of them. And that's why it's so important, CLES' Centre of Excellence and so forth, to promote the good stuff that's happening is epiphanies of possibilities, and how we all can get on this journey quickly, because the more of us on it, the more it will save the planet and everyone on it.
Brilliant.
Neil, can I just say, I think that's a really good point, because that's how we started at Wigan Council, and now we're looking at construction, highways, byways. We started in home care, £11 million contract, 2,000 hours, 2,000 people, but now it builds traction, doesn't it? And you think, actually, you can do it in that way. There are a lot of transferables here. How can we transfer some of this experience? So yeah, I agree. Start somewhere, not nowhere.
And just on that, Andrea, a lot of progressive economics, miserable buggers. We've got to be happy and sunny about the great things that do happen, and that's what's great with you and Peter. Like, that sunniness. This doesn't need to be miserable. It's a big challenge, but let's be really, really pleased of the successes and go again and again.
And that's what the summit last year by CLES, that's something I took away from Matt, I think he was called. Let's make procurement sexy. Let's make it kind of mistake. And I always say, kind of, the day that procurement, I put in figures and scores, it tells me the answer is the day that I don't do it. We influence, we shape, we change. And that's the exciting bit that you want to be part of, isn't it? You want to be a kind of placemaker, somebody influencing change. And I think that's right. And smile along the way, have a laugh if you can.
Oh, brilliant. Right, fantastic. I mean, there's a billion other questions that have just popped in, but we're gonna take a pause. I think I was just looking at your question, Carolina, about it was quite a technical question about food supply but it speaks to this broader question. So you get alongside people who are up for urban growing and small scale farming, but how do you plug them into a bigger system? And I know that people have been coming back in with answers to that, but I think that your question there, Carolina, speaks to what we've just been talking about in the panel, really, doesn't it? That we just need to get started with something, and who knows where the connections will come. And that I think is a great place to take a pause. Thank you very much to Neil and to Peter and to Andrea. We will hear from you a little bit later on if you're able to stick with us. Everybody go and take a deep breath, make a cup of tea, whatever. We'll have 5 minutes just to have a bit of a break before we come back to the breakout discussions. But while you're doing that, it would be really brilliant if you could take these few minutes with your cameras off or whatever to think about how does this resonate with the work and the challenges that you're dealing with in your place, and just stick a line or two in the chat about that so that we get a bit of a sense of what's going on in your places. So 5 minutes, we'll be back at 3:05. Turn your cameras off, we'll be back then. Stick something in the chat about how this resonates. Thank you. Okay, so next up on this agenda, I know that the conversation sort of feels like it's still going on with some of our panelists, so do keep those questions in the chat coming through, and we might be able to return to some of them at the end. But now we're going to get into the sort of meat of the actual workshop bit and get to hear from you all a little bit more. So we're going to break off into 5 breakout groups in a few moments' time. We're going to have a CLESer in the room with you, who will have the description that John gave you at the beginning of our live challenge for the day. And we have 3 questions for you to discuss in those breakout groups. So the first one is, what have you heard from today that's really resonated with your own experience? Secondly, are there examples, and people have already been sharing these, but for your groups, are there examples of work in practice, either in your own organisation or ones that you've heard on, which you think speak to some of the challenges and that we've been talking about so far? And then finally, and make sure that you've sort of got enough time for this in your groups, what would your group's 2 or 3 suggestions to our colleagues in Wales be on tackling the challenges that they've outlined? And you can take whatever angle on that you want. Short term, what do you do on Monday? What should you be aiming for in, to Neil's point, in the maximalist vision? So yeah, I suggest, we've got half an hour, suggest maybe 10 minutes, what's resonated, examples that you think speak to this agenda that people might be interested in, and then 20 minutes on what are the 2 or 3 things that you think that our colleagues in Wales should be doing to really realise their vision of growing a more generative economy, particularly in construction, in food supply and in home care. So that's our challenges. So we've got a good half an hour in your workshop, so we'll come back together again at 3:35. There'll be a CLES in each of your groups. They're there to help facilitate and stimulate discussion. It would be great if you could find somebody in each of your groups to take some notes, because we are going to do feedback afterwards. And I will see you there. Thanks very much. Great. Okay, so the challenge here, guys, is that feedback is like the worst bit of all of this, isn't it? So those of you who are feeding back, let me think, how could we do this in an interesting way? So just maybe start off with the thing that personally for you, like, of the feedback kind of really set your world on fire, and then fill in the rest. So that would be great. All right, so let's go to breakout room. Oh, hang on. I know that's not going to work because nobody knows what room they're in, do they? I'm just going to go in order of CLES people I can see. Lauren, I'm looking at you, and I was in Lauren's group. So we all agreed that Lauren was going to kick off and everyone else would jump in. So over to you, Lauren.
Okay, yeah. So am I just going through everything that we discussed?
Yeah.
So obviously we started off with what resonated. There was quite a few things. We had a really good discussion. One thing I thought was quite good is David was interested basically in Wigan about how they actually managed to build a procurement framework that was so preferential to local providers. And Andrea and Peter, feel free to jump in on the chat if we got any of this wrong, but Fran and Simon had kind of heard from Andrea the other week and thought that what they'd kind of managed to do in Wigan was get it so that there was kind of 50-50 interviews and paperwork rather than what might have been a sort of 70-30 model in the past. What that meant was that you're actually able to really hear from those providers, get to actually see them kind of face to face, and just set a completely sort of different culture to what might have happened if it was just purely kind of paperwork based. And we also had a bit of resonation with the fact that in Wigan they removed the kind of competitive element. You know, we sort of take for granted that markets are about competition, but it's not necessarily inevitable, and Wigan really kind of inspired us as to what is possible. Asif was on about how being community-led is key, and sort of had this great phrase of sometimes councils have a culture of automated thinking, and they have sort of got past the point of actually engaging with communities, but it's important to do that because it helps us understand what is missing. And finally, James said that, you know, whilst it might feel like we're not making loads of progress with this kind of work around co-ops, actually we are, and it's really important in workshops like this to actually celebrate those who are doing the trailblazing. So any community group or organisation that's taken over an asset, or any commissioner that's willing to challenge the status quo, they are the real champions. So I'll end that little section on quite a positive note. Then we had some good examples from people about what's happening in their area. So Simon in Oxford had a really good example about a local resident who realised that there was a need in her community, particularly during the pandemic. So she actually set up a counselling service within the Afro-Caribbean community in Oxford. So she did actually kind of struggle to become self-sustaining. So she struggled with capital deficit. She couldn't find any space. She also struggled to get the attention of the social services and the NHS. But what Simon felt was really important is that she sensed a need. And because of that, the quality of service and the relationship that she was able to deliver is far better than what might have come through any kind of procurement process. So the City Council in Oxford are now supporting her by finding her some space. They're also setting up a co-op with other wellbeing practitioners, and they're helping her to set up a wellbeing mobile clinic as well. The hope from that is that they'll then be able to link her into procurement frameworks with the local NHS trust and so on. But the question Simon had is, at what point in that scaling up process do you lose what might have been special about that service to begin with? So that kind of real connection that they have with a place. And then finally, we had our 2 or 3 ideas for Wales. So James kind of started us off with thinking about, we need to decide really, first of all, what we're going to invest in and think about how we're actually going to resource it, to understand that it is understood across all sectors. And it's also important to know what can you stop doing. So Fran gave us a good example of West Lothian, where someone who works there said that they keep feeding the beast in regard to employers who pay low wages. So sometimes it's actually not about what we can do, but what about, you know, about what we can stop doing, you know, unhelpful practices that we might already have in a local area. The second suggestion was from Tracy around procurement, kind of similar to the first point. We need to feel like we're not too curtailed or constrained by the process. So it's about being less siloed and thinking outside the box a little bit. So particularly a challenge for government and local government to be amplifiers of what's kind of going on in a local area, and to really challenge providers to do more. And we had a little bit of, you know, sorry if it's not that focused in terms of 2 or 3 things. I think with these things you always have lots of really good discussion, but we had a suggestion from Asif, who worked on a housing project in Calderdale, and the contractors there basically had to recruit within the local area. So the suggestion is really about ensuring you put in the correct conditions with a contract. And then we kind of rounded off with Fran, who was talking about, you know, bringing us back to the Mid Wales example, where what they found is that because they have so little suppliers, they often have to lower the terms in the contract. And what they actually found after doing a little bit of digging is that the businesses that they did have, you know, perhaps in the construction sector, just actually couldn't recruit enough staff. So they decided to build an infrastructure whereabouts the kind of local authority said, well, we'll help you recruit some staff via our sort of skills and employment team, as long as you meet certain standards with the contract. So sometimes when it comes to those large suppliers who might be kings in their local area, it's about finding ways to raise the bar of expectations and finding ways where we can utilize our own sort of assets. So yeah, I think that was everything. But anyone else in the group, or Fran yourself, you were in the same group, feel free to jump in case I missed anything there.
Oh, brilliant. As accurate as ever, Lauren. Brilliant. Yeah, I think that real focus on balancing the sort of supply side meets the demand side, and some places start with the demand and some places start with the supply, and then what's the crunch point often comes when you try and meet in the middle. So brilliant stuff. Thank you, Lauren. Okay, Gemma, I think you're doing feedback for group 2, is that right?
Yes, hold on, sorry, all my tabs have gone. You're only tiny, that's better. Okay.
Oh, you've got got a kind of operatic echo. It's lovely. Yeah.
Is it really bad?
No, it's good. Yeah, it's all good.
I'm sorry, I'll try my best. Okay, thank you. So yeah, we similarly, we had some really fantastic conversations, actually, really, really great conversations. And starting from things that we heard from today that resonated with us, we had quite a few conversations. Something we did speak about was that Colin had said that something that he's recognised, or something that maybe we all recognise, is that the areas that seem to be doing well or doing the best are the places that have got the strongest political leadership and ergo the belief in the new systems and community wealth building and in the principles and the foundations. And we found that interesting to consider, and then that rolled into talking about when we heard about the health and social care consultations that were going on. That brought Ewan on to speak about building trust with people, and how that resonated with him and in a project that he was working on, which was a co-production of mental health services. And he spoke then about how there's a difficulty there between, you know, the passion that people bring and the enthusiasm and the want and the desire to make change, but that also everyone comes with their own battles and their own struggles as well. So then we got on to talking a bit about communities of practice and how, and the importance of that, again, which was already discussed previously. Sarah then went on to chat about something that made her think about relating to social enterprise, And, you know, that came from thinking about when we're talking about the importance of policy and legislation. And she then came on to talk about social enterprise and, you know, and the importance of bringing small organisations into the supply chain. That then led us into talking, we actually spoke about like all three at the one time, so I'm trying to separate these back out from my notes, but that brought us into talking about examples of good work in practice. So leading on from what Sarah was saying, she worked on a project that was something that came with quite great success. He managed to procure quite a lot of money for businesses, for the development and starting of businesses, but it was recognised that the amount of money that was actually given based on what was used or what was uptake, there was quite a significant change between those two numbers. However, we wanted to really pinpoint that there was success there, that there was money found and granted, and that money was used successfully and beneficially for people. We also then were speaking about construction and social benefits and community benefits, and that led on to us talking about community asset transfers, something that I spoke about personally. I work in southwest Edinburgh, and at the moment I'm based in Wester Hailes. Some of you will know this because I've spoken to you before, but in Wester Hailes we're going through a number of community asset transfers just now, one which has been ongoing for a while and one which we're just starting. And we have been doing some really great community consultations. We spoke a bit about language and how the importance of language can really alter that and shape that. Because we spoke about how community wealth building comes with a lot of, I'm going to use the phrase jargon. It does. There's a lot of big words. There's a lot of stressful sentences, and actually sometimes just stripping it all back can help get a lot more buy-in from communities predominantly, but it also makes it a bit easier to then go to contractors and things as well. So we spoke about that and how those things are going quite well in the local area here. When it then came to the suggestions, I'd written down a couple. Now, again, everyone feel free to jump in if I've missed some of this, but something that we picked up on, I think it might have been Ewan who said this, but there's a real importance of providing the space for people's feelings and thoughts and ideas to be endorsed and supported, and that's even if that's things that are being said that are maybe not agreeable, or things that are being said that's maybe, you know, addressing the elephant in the room. But we recognise that the importance really is hearing people and really hearing them, really listening, but really, really hearing people, and the profound effect that has on communities. And then another suggestion that we spoke about was something that I've actually linked it in the chat if anyone wants to scroll up to see it. It's the Edinburgh and East of Scotland Communities portal. It's got a very, very long name and that's not it specifically, but that's come through Capital City Partnerships, which is a portal for community asks. It's a place where communities can go on and suggest things that they need or they want, or small businesses can go on and say that they are looking for something, and then larger businesses or anchor networks or whoever, councils, contractors can go on and then give those things, and that can be through, you know, tender for within a community benefit obligation, or that can come just from a company wanting to help a small business, and it's actually only launched last week, but we've already got about 42 asks on it, 2 of which are within Wester Hailes and 1 which has really hit the ground running already. So that's something that's going really well, and I put my email there if anybody wanted to talk about it further. I'd be more than happy to, but yeah, that I think was us.
Wonderful, thank you, Gemma. Great, and yeah, it sounds like there was an immense amount to talk about from your group. Great. Conrad, group 3. I'm conscious of time, so yes, fulsome but succinct. That would be great.
Okay. Well, I'll just reflect then on the interesting thing about our conversation. I think was the recognition of the 3 different natures of the market: the construction, the social care, and the food. You've got a very mature market with big developers, and actually the examples we were talking about and the gaps we were talking about was the nature of the support that small business into that market, that it's actually about raising aspiration and raising confidence that they can be a part of that sector. A lot of rather than just a generic business support company, are more tailored to what that company needs, and it needs to be linked to real opportunity, so they've got the confidence to go for that growth, to go for that. And that may be, it could be about working at the tier 2 level in the construction sector and using social value to drive those opportunities there through developers. Social care obviously seen as a fractured market. We didn't touch on it much, but Neil was mentioning that actually in Wales, they've got a far more developed mechanisms there for funding that sector that we don't have in England, and maybe there. I don't think I'm representing Neil's point effectively there. But then in the food one, the conversation got really excited because that was really seen as an emergent market where there was real opportunity to see how that market develops. And we had some examples in Scotland on providing organic schools and the Kindling Trust in Manchester about how new organisations are growing into this sector. But there's a real opportunity for the anchor institutions that. But I'll stop there because
Wonderful.
If any of the other participants feel I missed anything.
No, great, nice one, Conrad. 3 points, always good on that. Joshua, group 4, I think. That's Joshua.
Hello, just turning my camera on. Hope you can see me and hear me. So yeah, we had a really great discussion in our group, and I'll cover. It was quite mixed. We focused both on reflections and on then concrete actions. So it's kind of general takeaways. We heard from some people that it was quite difficult to find small things that we can push as a council, as a local authority, rather than trying to tackle everything at once, finding those parts of the supply chain of the market that you can effectively influence. And then also getting more people in the local authority thinking about local procurement, rather than it being a kind of a siloed thing where there are a group of people who are pushing it, getting it embedded in practice. And then we spoke a bit about the limits of a kind of target-focused approach to procurement. If you have quite strict, rigid targets that you're trying to meet, then those can't always be met. The example was given of a construction project involving an entire steel-framed building, and it just couldn't be sourced locally. But maybe we can compensate for things like that by identifying, again, those parts of the market that we can get local businesses to provide for, and just being a bit more flexible. And I think a kind of overarching theme related to this was that a relational approach to local businesses is probably the one to go for. So getting out of the office, seeking to influence and change the local market by speaking to local businesses. And I think this just is reiterating a lot of what we've already heard. One aspect of this was perhaps providing business finance or other resources to support those businesses, which aren't tiny, they're reasonably sized, but they're just not quite big enough to compete with some of those larger businesses that are winning tenders in your area. And within food specifically, we're thinking about challenges of the future, moving to modern food production technologies, and wanting to support local small businesses to play a part in that market, to provide so that you can share learning between them and things like that, because it's quite a disparate market with lots of small providers. And then finally on food, Lisa from Glasgow shared Glasgow's City Food Plan, which is apparently recently introduced and mentions community wealth building specifically, has some things in there about improving pay and employment rights for the food sector and strengthening the links between commercial organisations and market gardeners. Which sounded like quite a promising way to do this at the kind of city level. So please, colleagues, do come in if I missed anything there.
Brilliant, nice. That was, and always good to finish with it. And here's something we can all go away and read. Thank you, Joshua. Okay, Ellie, bring us home.
I'll try. Hi, everyone. So in terms of what resonated with us, we had a really interesting conversation about actually some of the challenges that we face internally in terms of driving forward an approach like this, and a really interesting discussion about kind of mindset within both procurement teams, commissioning teams, and also legal teams in terms of how to address building supply chains with more small local providers, and the hoops or relationships we have to build internally to try and make that happen. And Carolina had a very good way of describing it, where it was a sort of question of, are we all trying to outsmart the people who are blocking us within procurement teams? And can we just take the veil off that and have an open conversation about actually how do we work together to do better, essentially? And there was some really interesting insight from Vivian as well about kind of the mindset around risk within councils, and how that relates to opening new supply chains and thinking about how to connect with these businesses. And one thing that Vivian said that was really kind of stuck with me was, we have a very interesting tool set. We need a different mindset. when it comes to kind of thinking about procurement and community wealth building. In terms of examples that we heard about, there were loads, so I'm not going to go into all of them, but the two that really stuck with me were that in North Ayrshire, there's some really interesting work going on around vehicle maintenance contracts and some really intensive support work that's being driven through procurement for local businesses. So providing skills and training in terms of the bidding process and engaging people within that sort of process, and that's resulted in a lot of local suppliers delivering those types of services. On top of that, some brilliant work that's gone on in Birmingham around two different areas. So the first one is thinking about smaller contracts and the sort of the lower level of risk that comes with using smaller contracts to bring local providers into supply chains. And I'm sure Conrad will have a report somewhere that he can share in the chat to articulate that, because it's a piece of work that's really quite interesting. And the other is again around food. So in Birmingham, the council are working to see if they can follow the suit of Preston to split tenders into lots to encourage more local food suppliers to get into school meal contracts. But to get to that point, they're very understanding of the fact that there are already people in this space producing excellent products, but they don't want to scale up. So they're building a food co-op for Birmingham, working with the Open Food Network and Slow Food Birmingham, and looking at how to build that confidence in the market. So they're looking to improve logistics and build the market before actually connecting it into the local authority and other providers, like public sector providers locally. So their role as a local authority is really investing in the logistics and looking at how to support that cooperative before linking it into those kind of procurement processes and supply chains. So in terms of the 2 or 3 suggestions that we had, the first was from Sarah around employee ownership in home care. We need more employee ownership in home care. That's something that's really been kind of taking off in Scotland. And that has come about as a result of succession. So people moving out of the business and passing it on. And that is something to look at maybe in Wales. The second was that there are loads of people already doing really good things, as we've heard today, but they're just not aware of what other people are doing. So there's something about having a capacity building role in the area to be a broker with other people either locally or nationally who can offer support around this and can give ideas and really bring people together to work on these solutions. And the final thought was off the back of what we heard from Wigan, that they really were interested in the unintended consequences of procuring the way that they were. So there's something in looking at the way that these places are procuring, and if there are any unintended consequences that can be addressed at the source, so how they can think about their own processes alongside thinking about how to actually use those mechanisms to support the development of supply chains. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Well, there you go, John. Go take that back to our friends in Wales. Yeah, exactly. Wow, such a lot. You know, this session's really reminded me about the thing I love about the Community Wealth Building Summit is that it's like a really unlikely collection of us that get together. I mean, some of us know each other really well, but actually it's not often that we get the opportunity to get together and hear the breadth of voices and experience and wisdom that we've heard in this session and lots during the week. So it's just been brilliant. I am going to invite, Andrea's had to go and build some community wealth in Wigan, so she's not actually with us, but I'm going to invite Pete and Neil to say a last few words before we wrap up. So Pete, can I go to you first and then we'll come to Neil?
I will, yeah, I'll keep it summarised, but first of all, thank you for having me on. It's been really eye-opening, stroke mind-blowing in some ways, particularly when you listen to Neil. You want to jump out of the window and go and do something about it, don't you? I think the two things that I'll take away from it, from what I've heard today, is I think that one of the things I mentioned early on was that tender and commissioning processes are a barrier to small businesses trying to build up business. They just are at the moment. Unless you're very well established, you've got very little chance. And I think that needs to be overhauled, stroke revolutionised before anything can really work with there, you know. Again, Neil said it right. So use the tender process to shape the market, or else the market won't change its shape if it's just left to its own devices. And I wholeheartedly support that. And I think also from my perspective, try and find a way of growing some ambition by redesign. So we've talked about consortia quite a lot and consortiums, and maybe looking at something or a body that can help coordinate or broker consortiums that would be supported by the ultimate buyer. So whether it be a council or a commissioning body, something that can be in place to put those things together, if you like, and then let them go forward on a fair basis, but let them go forward. And I just see a big gap there at the moment, but it's a fantastic experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete. We've absolutely loved having you here today. So yeah, there'll be more invites coming your way, I can tell. Neil, do you want to wrap up for us?
Yeah, very quickly. I think the leadership point was made. It was a really important point. Leadership is important, political leadership that can cut through things. I think we just need to reinstate that we've talked a bit about procurement, but ultimately procurement's the means to the end. And the end, of course, has to be more inclusive forms of ownership and the pre-distribution of wealth to attack that whole problem of extraction of wealth. So ownership is key here. And finally, just what Mr. Arthur, the Minister for Community Wealth, or Planning, Public Finance, Community Wealth, said, and close to the democracy tablet is hard, is those three things that are needed, that are important. Practice, so getting on and do it, that whole epiphany is a possibility. Policy, we should never forget policy. The policy context is really important. We need decent policy. And arguably, across the United Kingdom, we've got variations in policy. And sadly, parts of England the poorest policy for this agenda. But we need deep policy. And then we need movement building. This is what this event does. It's about all of us working together from different walks of life and different experience, different knowledge, and come at different angles to kind of commune. And I always finish most conferences at this end, but I always want to say it. It's like we need to collaborate like mad. That's the challenge, to collaborate like mad. So thanks for the invite. Thanks.
Wonderful.
You've heard that before, Fran.
I certainly have. And what better note to finish on? So thank you very much. And it's bang on 4 o'clock. I've never finished a workshop on time in my life. So there you go. A first for everything. Thank you very much, everyone. And hopefully see many of you at the summit tomorrow. And fill in your postcards about what you're going to do on Monday, please. That would be great to see many of you tomorrow. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.